This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Solinska. I'm your host. And today I'm joined by Stacy Benge. Thank you very much for joining us, Stacy.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So nice to have you. And we are here to talk about what many parents worry about and often say, my child can't read yet. And this is really important to unpick. And this is what we'll be really delving into today. And interestingly, parents often say this at different ages and stages of their child's development. So really depending on the pressures they feel externally on what their child should be able to do, in quotation marks, at a certain age. So we'll be really kind of addressing this. So, Stacey, you're the author of your book, The Whole Child Alphabet, and you'll be talking about your kind of knowledge and experience around how children develop literacy. You're very much grounded in child development. So it would be brilliant for you to give us a little bit more of a context around your work, what you do, your area of expertise, and then we can really get cracking on with delving deeper into this topic.
Yeah, I'm Stacy Benge, and I'm from the Dallas, Texas area. And I've been working in early childhood for about 30 years. My career started working with young children, birth to 5, when I was in college or university. I originally started studying speech, language, and pathology, and then switched that to child development, and then ended up getting my bachelor's and master's degree both in human and child development. And then my career just really kind of took me where I started honing my interest really in on language and literacy, and then physical development. And a lot of what I learned with physical development came from my journey as a parent. And but what I really started to realize was how physical development and language development are really the core of early literacy. And then when you start looking at how that develops, that develops best through child-led play. And so that really started to become my mission, when I stepped out of the classroom and started going into more consulting and speaking and presenting. I found that I was getting super excited making those connections of language and physical development and play, and how that really is the foundation of creating strong readers and writers. And that's what brought me to writing my book, which just came out last year, but I've been writing on it since 2020. But that really is kind of, I guess you would say, my journey of getting here to this point, and how I really kind of honed in on my passion of language and literacy.
Mm-hmm. It's so great to hear that this was kind of a real, like you say, journey, and not just something that you thought, oh, one day, actually, this is really interesting, I'm just going to get going with it. Actually, it was really influenced by yourself as a parent, like you say. So it's great to hear about all those influences, and that the things that we're talking about today are actually you're very much in tune with as a parent yourself.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I always joke, like, I learned a lot, in school, and I learned a lot in my career, but I feel like my journey as a parent really just kind of topped everything off. And it made everything make sense when I saw everything come to play with my own children as they were growing up.
Mm-hmm. And on the topic of reading specifically, so in terms of rushing children into learning to read too early, let's discuss some of the issues around this. So in your experience, what kind of things have you seen and read about in terms of how this impacts children in a negative way? I mean, I would instantly kind of go there. But let's kind of be a little bit more open-minded. How does this influence children if we really rush them into reading too early? And actually, what does too early even mean? Like I said earlier, kind of in quotation marks, what children should be able to do at a certain age. Let's unpick this a little bit in terms of that developmental perspective.
Yeah, and I think that, and I honestly think that we're seeing this in a lot of different parts of the world, but we kind of have this notion that for children to be successful, they have to encounter academics at an earlier age. And, and we start kind of panicking a little bit and going, okay, we have to get children reading earlier and writing earlier. And I call it the earlier is better myth. And the reality is earlier readers and earlier writers are not necessarily that's not developmentally responsive. An early reader does not mean they're going to be an advanced reader, and an early writer does not mean they're going to be an advanced writer. And I think what happens when we buy into this earlier is better myth is that we start ignoring child development. And that really was the purpose of my book, was to take a developmental perspective on this, not look at instruction or academic programs, but really look at what developmentally needs to be in place for children to eventually be readers and writers when the time comes for them. And when you really start breaking that down, it really kind of gives us a pause to go, okay, we shouldn't be putting a pencil in their hand at age 2. We shouldn't necessarily be, doing flashcards or really trying to instruct them to read. Instead, we want to switch our focus to, developing those visual processing skills, developing the phonological awareness, developing physically. It's amazing how much our physical development ties into reading. We don't think of things like holding a book and turning a page and our eyes being able to go left to right. Well, that hinges on the brain and the body learning to work as a team. And so when we really look at those fundamental skills, I think it really gives us the knowledge to go, hey, we need to pause and we need to really focus on this development. And one of the things I say throughout my book is literacy, we need to look at it not as a matter of teaching, but as a matter of developing.
I love that. Yeah, it's really great to be able to have that focus at the forefront of your mind, that it's about the child's development first and foremost, rather than what do I, as a parent, an adult, or an educator, instruct the child to do. And I was going to also mention that the fact that you talk about physical development being a really important aspect of children's early literacy, reading, writing. And actually that may come to as a surprise to many parents, because especially when they are at a stage when they're feeling worried about their child's reading, they may not, when usually from my experience, they don't think that, there might be an issue here with physical development, or we need to address physical development. Actually, it's about addressing the academic side, as you mentioned, the phonics, the sitting down and learning formally to read or write.
It really is amazing when we step back and look at how much physical development plays into this. And this is something, again, a journey as a parent. My oldest son, he's an adult now, but I have a picture of him in the book, and it's him sitting in his chair with a vest over his knees, and he's kind of covering up his eyes. And his teacher sent it to me, and she's like, "This is how he learns." And I show that picture to show how physical development is needed for us just to be able to sit and learn. And my son had some physical delays that we hadn't quite figured out at that point. I was just like, well, he's just trying to stay comfortable in his chair. Well, we now know that his mind was really paying attention to how do I stay in the chair, not listening to his teacher. And he had to do some occupational and physical therapy for about 4 years. And when we started kind of redeveloping his body and getting his body strong and his brain and his body working as a team, so not just his muscles, but some of the internal senses, it's amazing how much his academic performance increased. And of course, I'm talking about a child who's like 10 and 11 at the time. But, that's one of the reasons I'm like, children need to be climbing and swinging and moving and, really developing the body. And another thing too, is when we look specifically at reading, our vestibular system, which is our sense of balance, that is needed for us, first of all, to pay attention. The core of paying attention is our vestibular system being developed. But us being able to hold a book and our eyes staying steady on the line, and then our eyes going, swiftly down to the next line as they're moving. Well, that hinges on the vestibular system. That's that
Okay.
sense of balance. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and the vestibular system does not develop unless children actually engage it. And so that's why we see children swinging a lot and spinning and hanging upside down, because their brain's telling them we need to develop this vestibular system, and it won't develop if children are being stagnant and still. And so this is like one of the connections I try to make for parents and for teachers, that this movement on the playground is actually critical to eventual reading. We don't always connect it that way, but that really is a core thing that has to be developed.
Yeah. And when you break it all down like that, it really does make sense. And I guess the practical takeaways and tips for parents here would be, like you say, getting children playing outdoors,
Uh-huh.
especially because there's so much more space and opportunity there, getting them climbing, balancing,
Mm-hmm.
running, jumping, just lots of various movement, a variety of movement, a lot of physical development opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing too, that like our ability to cross our midlines.
Mm-hmm.
So, crossing left or right, that develops with a lot of movement, and it's a whole brain thing. But that ability to cross the midline again ties into the eyes going left and right. It
Yeah.
ties into our body being able to cross, and turn the pages of a book. It ties into us being able to hold the book with one hand and then move the other side of the body. We
Mm-hmm.
don't, 1 and 2 year olds and 3 year olds don't quite have that ability because it hasn't developed yet. Well, how does it develop? A lot of playing, a lot of running around, a lot of that outside big body time. And so that's how all that connects. And it really is the foundations of reading.
Hi, it's Angelica here. Thank you all for listening in. I'm here to ask for a quick favour from the early years community. In order for the Voice of Early Childhood to continue creating free, valuable content and sharing voices, we need your help. Please hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening on. And if you are listening on a podcast platform, then check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can not only listen, but also watch the podcast and really focus in on the discussions. Or if you are viewing on YouTube already, remember that you can also find us on 19 different podcast platforms. Simply search for The Voice of Early Childhood and subscribe to get a brand new episode every Monday morning, ready for your morning commute or however you start your week. And as always, do share the podcast with colleagues, friends, and parents of young children. We have a lot of interested parents and family members listening in and reading the articles. So let's ensure more of them can access the free content. Let's encourage them to engage and keep these thought-provoking discussions going. Enjoy the rest of the episode. And if we unfortunately rush children too fast when they're not ready, then it really has massive impacts on their future kind of reading and all learning, really, in terms of that losing that interest and especially reading, losing that love for reading, love for learning, because they're just not developmentally ready. So they will get frustrated and they will struggle and they will feel deflated and almost helpless, and as if they're failing to do something that you're asking them as an adult to do. So it's really, really vital to be able to ensure that, like you said, developmentally look at the child rather than what are we needing to teach them. So really tuning into the child's development. And I guess for a parent, for educators, we are trained to do that. And of course, there can always be more training. And recently, in the UK context anyway, in England, we have been speaking for the last few years around the fact that there's not enough training on child development, something to really address. But for parents in particular, it's really hard to really tune in into that child's development. And you mentioned earlier when the time comes for them. So when it's kind of the right time for that individual child. But I guess, how do you know when it's the right time, for instance, to begin reading a little bit more formally, like using phonics? What kind of examples could you give for parents to kind of look out for and think, okay, maybe I can introduce the kind of phonetic side of things, especially if they're like homeschooling and they don't necessarily have that support from the education setting school?
I think one of the we've got to look at their visual perception being developed and their phonological awareness. I think before we start any formal instruction. I also think that we need to look for children having print awareness, so understanding that print carries meaning, and this is a developmental thing as well. But like really looking, I always say follow the children's cues, and they will kind of start to tell you when they're interested. So we always want to make sure as parents that we're always reading with children. I think bringing print into our environment, so actually writing in front of children. Our digital technology has kind of robbed children of seeing us use print in a meaningful context. So finding opportunities to write a grocery list in front of children, but, having those experiences. And then children will start to ask you, they'll start to ask you about the letters. And one of the reasons I say follow the children's cues is I think we sometimes get, again, so panicked about it or excited that we're like, well, this is an A, this is a B. But if we just show print and reading in a meaningful context, it's pretty amazing when children start to make the connection. They will start to ask us, what is that? I remember when I was little, I used to watch my mom write the bills, like write the checks. And then like she would put it in an envelope and I'd watch her, write the envelope. And I remember that like I would get a pencil and paper and I would kind of make little squiggles and I would ask her, what does this say? So I was showing her that I understood that when I saw her writing, that it meant something, that it was carrying a meaning. So that was kind of showing I was starting to make that those connections of print awareness. So watching cues with that. And then I think too, if we give children the opportunity to draw a lot, like just blank paper and crayons, eventually their drawings will start to kind of look like something and they'll start to attribute meaning to it, but they will start to put letters on their paper. You'll see them, most likely it's going to be the first letter of their first name. And that is when they're really showing us, I understand the concept of print. I understand the concept of a letter, that's used to convey meaning. And I think that's really when children start to make the connection. Now, I think it's important that we don't start going, okay, let's get the workbooks, or let's start doing this. I think it's bringing that writing and reading into meaningful context. If we're playing and we want to create a list for something, or again, like I mentioned earlier, if we're going to the grocery store, let's sit down with the child and come up with like 3 or 4 things we might get that would be meaningful to them, something we might pack in their lunch or something that they're going to be eating at home, and let them hold that list and mark that off. But I think it's bringing reading and writing in from that context, not necessarily, like I said, getting the workbooks or the flashcards or whatever it may be.
Yeah, so part of the day-to-day routine really and daily life in that kind of everyday context. And as you say, children being able to understand that print holds meaning, so really being exposed to a wide variety of text, not just books and books aimed at their age, I guess, but a variety of texts around them, and noticing texts when they're going for walks, and and noticing different marks or symbols and picking up on that, and I guess encouraging the child to look around for things, and also something I guess with reading as well. And this isn't not necessarily, so this is very much kind of the phonological aspect of things, of being able to understand that letters sound a certain way, so different letters have different sounds, which is basically phonics. And so what I used to say for parents is, when you're walking around, just really, or when you're sat down, tune into your surroundings. And what I did with my preschool children, we would sit down And in the garden, usually it would be quite nice because you can really hear kind of the world around you, the cars, as well as, the preschool setting. And we just, for a couple of minutes, just be as still as we could and listen to everything around us. And there might be cars going by, but there might be something really loud. And one child would say, oh, that's a tractor. I think that's a tractor because it's really loud, and listening to the birds. And I think that really supports children's, like you say, that phonological awareness and the fact that they are tuning into sounds themselves. And that really supports that very early reading, almost, well, pre-phonics, pre-formal phonics anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing, like just hearing those environmental sounds and the brain really, developing that auditory attention as well to be able to kind of tune out that white noise or whatever you might call it that's in the background and really tune into what is it that I'm supposed to be listening to. And imagine that skill for a child who's in a classroom where they're having to drown out the background noise, but really, focus in on what the teacher is saying. And kind of like to that point, as you mentioned, another, thing for parents, I keep always saying when you go to the grocery store, because to me, like it's, we call it grocery stores here, the market or whatever. But if you have a child in the cart, a lot of times they're face to face with you and it's a great time to have conversations. But making sure that your child is present, not being plugged in and looking at a screen, because that really does rob them of opportunities of hearing just variety of sounds in their environment. And if children are up looking around and they make eye contact with another person, that person's going to have conversations with them. Well, that's the brain hearing more and more language and the brain developing that ability to hear and produce sound, or really develop that phonemic awareness, which is the brain's ability to isolate the smallest unit of sound and language. So for the brain to develop that ability, the brain has to hear a lot of language. And so I just think of all the opportunities in a grocery store if a child is just looking around and being present, but they lose those opportunities if we plug them into a digital device. And so I think it's just sometimes those small, simple, but consistent experiences that really help develop these foundations.
That's a really good point around technology. And I would often say, and sometimes this can be controversial in terms of technology being really beneficial for children, and not to kind of get too worried about taking it away, but actually understanding how does it support their learning, rather it be a replacement for interactions or a behavior management tool. Actually use technology to support learning, to research together, and really enhance the learning rather than take that learning away. Like you say, in terms of language, it would only take it, that development away from children, like you say, especially if they're plugged in and really focused on one thing, when actually surrounding them are many opportunities for a wide variety of language, vocabulary, sounds.
And I something else to keep in mind, like hearing actual sounds affects the brain so much more positively than hearing like a digital sound. Digital sounds are not, although, okay, let me rephrase this. Digital technology is real life for us. It's how you and I are talking right here, across the pond with each other. There's great, wonderful things, but hearing the sounds on a digital device is not real world. It's not the same as hearing actual real world sounds. And so making sure that, we are balancing it, and we are, like you said, using it on ways that can be interactive and but not to pacify the time.
Yeah. And I guess to your point of technology, sounds on technology, especially speech, I guess, when it is kind of digitized and not a real person's voice, I guess, when we're speaking now and podcasts and things like this, obviously there's real people there. But if they've been kind of digitally created, sometimes, and maybe a lot of the time, there isn't enough depth there. And for instance, that intonation and, that kind of up and down of the voice, and you're not really able to gauge that emotion as well, I guess. There's a lot of benefits of everything kind of being very much real life, face to face, Yeah, and it's just about not taking those opportunities away from children with technology, because technology has so many benefits, but they are very much in addition to real life.
Exactly. Yes.
And I was going to mention something as well. Actually, when we talk about the alphabet and then we talk about phonics, this is something that parents often get very confused. And I know your book is called The Whole Child Alphabet, right? Yes.
Yes.
So in terms of the alphabet, a lot of parents I've seen before would kind of teach their child the alphabet and say A, B, C rather than A, B, K, and the phonetic way. And that can get really confusing, especially when they start to learn phonics. And I don't want to get too into this because there's obviously lots of different phonics programs out there. In the UK, we have so many. In England and obviously around the world, there's lots of different approaches. But I think it's just important to say, to really be able to understand if your child is attending school, a nursery setting, childminder, nanny, anyone who is supporting their development and learning, if they are using a specific approach to learning to read and using a specific maybe phonics program or approach, then it's important to remain consistent so the child doesn't start getting confused and hears all these sounds, and to them it's just so abstract. It's just a mark, and actually this mark now has several meanings, several sounds, and it just gets so confusing.
Yes. And one of the things that I really talk about in my book, which again, I go back to what are the foundations that need to be in place before children can learn the alphabet. Like I mentioned, the print awareness, our visual perception, I think is super important. It's something we don't give enough credit to, like the brain's ability to actually decipher what these different markings are and discriminate between a D and a B. And that depends on our spatial relations. And so a lot of those things that we want to focus on that development. And then, that phonemic awareness. But I think a lot of this too, no matter what program you're using or what the approach is, children have to have the concept of what actually is a letter. It actually is something that's used to carry meaning. And if children don't have that developed, they can memorize squiggles and they can kind of memorize, okay, when I see this squiggle, I say whatever the sound is. But I think any program, it's all just memorization unless children actually understand the concept, of a letter. And I think once that is developed, and again, children will show us that in their drawings and they're asking what's in the environment. But I think beyond that point, I think there's so many different approaches. I know over here in the States, phonics approaches are not near as prevalent as they are over in the UK. I think over here there's a lot of the whole language approach and kind of the sight words and but I think my stance is no matter the approach, the development needs to be there first. And then, making sure that if we are introducing the alphabet and the sounds, that children actually have a concept of what it is that they're learning about.
Yeah.
And
so
I think
really
it's the same for numbers as well. We can, we can even have where children can name them off, but if the concept is not there, it's just kind of the surface short-term memorization that they have.
Yeah. So really, just like what you said, understanding what they are learning and not just learning almost for them, it would be learning for the sake of learning or learning for the sake of doing what the adult says. Actually understanding what they're learning is of benefit in so many contexts.
Yes.
And understanding that, for instance, the alphabet is what the letters look like and what they are called, and then kind of their names, and then the kind of when we go into the phonics side of things, then what they sound like. So really unpicking that, and I guess delving deeper with the child, and not being afraid to kind of slow all of that down, I guess. So the child really masters their understanding rather
Mm-hmm.
than introducing everything and they can recite all the letters of the alphabet, but actually they have no idea what it means. And like you say, very similar for numbers as well. A child can count to 10 often and actually have no idea what the numbers mean, and they won't be able to tell you what a number kind of stands for, looks like, the different kind of meanings behind, the whole kind of aspect of subitization and like the
Mm-hmm.
fiveness of five. What does that number actually mean? Rather than just potentially understanding that this is what it's called and that's that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, children, it's amazing what children can memorize and what they can regurgitate, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like, is it actually? So I think if we just kind of take pause and just build that strong foundation, and instead of like rushing, to get them to learn these skills, but just stepping back and allowing for this development, and keeping in mind that this development takes place best through child-led play. Like when
Mm-hmm.
we let children move their bodies the way they need to, we let them play what they want to play and how long. It's amazing how these fundamentals and foundations are created. And then it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing if we just kind of like just give that some time, that when it does come time to introduce, formal reading or
Mm-hmm.
formal writing, like how much more that will resonate and how much, the children will be ready for it.
Mm-hmm. And it's really important to be able to strike that balance and not just give children complete child-led play with absolutely zero input from the adult, because it's so important to be able to build on what they're learning and support them and not overtake it,
Yes.
and not interfere. But, like what we were saying earlier about ensuring that the child is exposed to a variety of print. That is
Mm-hmm.
very much part of the adult setting up the environment in a
Mm-hmm.
way which is going to support the child's learning, when they are learning through their own child-led play, or taking them to places where they can be exposed to print, and more kind of texts, and also providing that rich language and a wide range
Mm-hmm.
of vocabulary. So when the child is engaging in their own child-led play, the adult, instead of entirely always standing back, kind of sensitively interacting and trying not to really interfere and overtake the play, but interacting and adding to the child's play by enriching their language, introducing new vocabulary when it makes sense in the context. It's just striking that balance, isn't it? It's really, it's a fine line.
It is, and I call it's just kind of reading the situation, and it's kind of
Mm,
like, um, I equate it to if I go to somebody's house for dinner, and we have our interaction, and I follow the cue of my host, and I kind of let them lead, but I ask, can I help clean up the dishes? And we keep the conversation going. I kind of That's kind of the scenario that I relate when we enter a child's play. If they
mm,
invite us in, you follow their cues. They're still the host of the play. They're still in control, but we can offer, can I help you with the dishes? But, can I
yeah.
build this? Can I get us some more materials or whatever it may be? But so it's still following the children's cues, but us still being very active and interactive in the situation.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what we often also see or hear parents describe is that their child may be engaging in lots of activities, maybe very physical, through their old child-led play, but they're never really showing that much interest in any kind of early literacy or reading. And I guess they're still developing all of the kind of the physical development aspects, like with what we mentioned, vestibular, proprioception. But parents do still worry that actually there's kind of kind of zero examples of them, or links to any kind of early literacy, and maybe when they try to bring that in, then they don't show any interest. What would you say to parents in that situation?
So I always say that, first of all, just because play might not be labeled as literacy does not mean it's not supporting literacy. So all play, no matter what it looks like, big body play, outside play, block play, dramatic play, it all supports those literacy foundations. So rest assured in that. So, when we understand those foundations, I think it kind of helps us, breathe on that a little bit. But I think, and I kind of mentioned earlier, one of the reasons I love having blank paper and crayons always available is I feel like children always find a reason to bring that into play. So if I'm building a block structure and I have some cars going, I might want a billboard that I want to bring in. So I'm going to draw that, and that really is the beginning of literacy right there. We can have some books available that might come into the play, but I think that when children have the ownership or the empowerment to draw something that they can bring in, that very much is a very literacy connected experience. And I think it's just, again, following the children's cues and keeping in mind, children develop at different rates. They have different interests. And just because they're not going and asking you to read a book, or they're not showing an interest on how to spell anything, does not mean that they're not going to be a reader or a writer. It just means that their interest is over here for whatever reason. And then as trusting, as long as they're still playing and they're engaging their bodies and they're hearing the sounds and they're using their visual perception, they're building those foundations that will support literacy. And when the time comes, they'll show an interest when they're ready. One of the stories I tell in my book is my youngest son, who just got married last week, but he when he was like 3, 4, and 5, he showed really no interest in the alphabet, like no interest really in reading. It just wasn't there. Well, he went to kindergarten, which is like over here in the States, that's our first step into elementary school. And he developed a huge crush on his teacher. So he's about 5.5 at the time. And he learned his alphabet within a matter of days. And it wasn't because of instruction. It was because his motivation was he wanted to get his teacher's attention because he, wanted her to marry him. My husband and I are like, wait, what just happened? Well, what happened was it was on his terms. It was his motivation. And that's what he needed. So I think it's us just kind of trusting children too. And they're going to tell us when they're ready. Now, I know our school systems do not always allow for that. So I think that's why we as parents or us as early educators, we need to advocate and start speaking out about. But I think it's just resting assured your child's going to be okay. Your child's going to be just fine.
I think that's probably a really great place to kind of wrap up this conversation. It's a really great message to be able to send out to parents and educators as well about the fact that we need to be advocating for what's right for children, and it is starting from their development and where they are at rather than all those external pressures. So it's definitely something for everyone to take away with them. And I guess I'll just kind of do a quick summary of what we discussed. And for me, kind of the biggest takeaway, I guess, from our discussion is for parents to remember that we should not be rushing our children into reading, especially the academic and formal learning side of things, but fostering an interest in reading through frequent exposure to books and other texts is vital. And that language, as you mentioned, and then importantly, physical development. So I guess like what you were saying at the end there as well, as long as they're still playing and moving. And actually, if we see a child sitting still and not doing anything, that's when we should be worrying. That's when they're maybe not, not learning, not developing, not playing. When they're just static. So as long as the child is moving, they are learning. That's the big message, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, Stacey, for joining on the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. We've had a really, I think, great discussion where we touched on so many things, and even like mentioned maths, because actually that is reading, reading letters, and they carry meaning. The marks, for children, a letter that they see like a door number is a mark, but actually it carries meaning and they begin to understand that. So actually everything we see around us is is kind of steeped in early literacy for children. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to recognize all these things for parents, I think. And our discussion, like I say, as we've touched on so many things, I think it's really demonstrated how wide ranging literacy really is, mm-hmm. and how much opportunity there is for reading everywhere. So yes, thank you very much. And to all of those listeners and viewers, Stacey's article can be found on the Voice of Early Childhood website, along with a link to Stacey's book as well. Yes. And if you enjoyed this episode and would like to listen to more and read more on early literacy, then check out the podcast episodes and articles so there's one by Tasha Bretten, Supporting Families and Understanding Phonics Through Music. Again, kind of very much holistic approach. And also Helen Battley, My Child Can't Write Yet. So kind of very similar to this in terms of we do discuss, proprioception and vestibular. So very much kind of both of these episodes building on each other. So yes, lots of things to have a look there, and the links are in the episode description. And finally, once again, thank you very, very much, Stacey, for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us.
Thank you.